Thanks very much, Andrea. I'm sure that you'll all agree that that was a great little session there. I think it's really important when we, talk about the opportunities and Andrea talked about opportunities. We need to take those opportunities. We need to make an opportunity ours. And I've very much been one of those people that I don't believe that things are privileges and that we don't have the right to be able to do something. I guess part of that is being the youngest in my family of four, 57 years old, still get called the spoilt brat of the family. I'm very grateful to both my mother and my grandmother. I talk about being raised by two very strong black island women who, basically said to me, the only person that's going to stop you doing something is yourself. And I still can see my grandmother standing in front of me telling me these sorts of things. My mother, my dear mother, who's still with us, still to this day rolls her eyes at me when I, go to do something or not do something. And I still remember all of the things that she did and the sacrifices that both my mother and father did to allow me to be able to do the things that I did myself. Setting goals, I think, is really important. And we need to set those goals. And they don't have to be long-term things. You can make a decision that in 5 or 10 years you want to do a particular thing, but you can have little, milestones and checks along the way. I've had a great privilege living in Canberra. I originally came here for 12 months. And, Ngunnawal country got me. Last October, long weekend, I celebrated 35 years in this beautiful country. Never thought I would be a public servant. Celebrated 28 and a half years in the public service. I don't know whether I actually call that celebrate, but spent 28 and a half years in the public service. Andrea, when she talked about doubting herself, a little story that I'll impart is that when Karen was on the lookout for a deputy CEO at RA, we had a conversation. And I said, I think I know somebody who'd be really good. So I gave Andrea a call and I said, great opportunity, Deputy CEO at RA. I thought you'd be really good. Can I set up a conversation for you to have with Karen? She said to me, I actually wrote an application for that job, but I didn't hit send because I didn't think I could do it. And I just went, girl, you can do that job. Have the conversation. And, she's gone on to great things. So, I often... watching the journeys of lots of people around here. Of course, I'm old and I've been around for quite some time. I like to tell the story of Michelle. People got lots of stories about Michelle. But I remember Michelle DeShong, 18 years old, turning up in Canberra, cold Canberra. I got to spend a lot of time with Michelle when she was first here in Canberra. Used to spend a lot of time reading stories and playing games with my eldest daughter. And to see where Michelle has come and just the opportunities that Michelle has created for herself, use that as a great opportunity. Kerry Arabina, Kerry and I have got funny history. I worked at one stage for the Office for the Status of Women, invited Kerry to come onto a national advisory committee that Amanda Vanstone, our minister at the time, was heading up. Spoke to Kerry the day before the first meeting, see you there tomorrow. Hadn't actually met her face-to-face at this point in time. She said, yep, I'll be there. The day of the meeting occurred, no Kerry. And I thought, they've all telling me that this woman's real deadly and that she's reliable and she's great. And I spoke to her yesterday and she didn't turn up. And so I rang her later that afternoon to find out why she didn't turn up. The night before, Minister Vanstone had made an announcement that wasn't particularly good for, women and our mob. And she just went, I am not going to sit on an advisory committee to that woman. And she didn't. But the great thing about that interaction that I had with Kerry is the fabulous friendship that we've had over many years and some of the great things that Kerry and I have done together. And also what we have ahead of us. Another one of our participants over here, Miss Danusha Kabillo. Danusha, she's shaking her head at me because she knows the story I'm going to tell. Danusha, is on her own journey. only the last couple of years back in the workforce after becoming a mum. But many, many years ago when I worked for Dua, I needed somebody to come and be an assistant for me to do some bits and pieces. So I interviewed Danusha. She came in all, excited, but very nervous because I didn't know at the time it was her first kind of really formal interview. She had her little portfolio to show me. I asked her, I told her what I needed to happen and could she do it, and she said yes. And I said, okay, then I'll be back in contact with you. She goes, oh, you don't want to see my portfolio? I said, oh, no, it's all good. At the time, she was doing a contract with ATSIC. She went back to work. She said, oh, I've just had this interview at Dua, and they said, oh, what doing? And she said, oh, working for Robin Forrester. Now, she still has never told me who it was, but to this day, that person said, oh, you don't want to work for her, she's a bitch. You do not want to work for her. So anyway, I rang her up to say, congratulations, you got the job, I can give you a contract. She lied to me. She said, I've gotten back here, I told them I went for an interview, so they've extended me for another 12 months. So I went, okay. Many years later, we crossed paths again in Faxia, and now I'm godmother to her children. So, watching that journey there. Probably my oldest and dearest friend in the room, Mr. Morris Walker. Yeah, we go back a long way. People do actually think we're brother and sister. It's kind of quite funny when people say, yeah, you do look alike. Don't know where, we both got black hair and we both use hair dye. But Morris has always been there for me and assisted me on my journey, and I'm very grateful for having him and his family as a part of my life. There's many other people in this room. But anyway, enough about that. We are about to have our last keynote speaker for the afternoon. I am very, very excited to introduce Ivan Ingram. I've read a lot about Ivan. I've, a bit excited about having him here. A young person that's starting to step up and lead the way in areas that are really important for our mob. But Ivan is a Wiradjuri and Filipino man from Parkes. I just got to say, I really love when our mob, who do have mixed heritage, celebrate that. I used to always say to people, I'm an Aboriginal Australian South Sea Island woman, and if truth be known, I'm probably more Irish than anything else. Hence, I had my ancestry DNA done and was very disappointed when the Irish wasn't very much. But I did discover that I had 20% South Asian. So, and I think a lot of our mob have that. He currently practices in the area of native title with a background in both native title determination, applications, future acts and cultural heritage. He's also undertaking a full-time Doctor of Judicial Science candidature at the University of Arizona. Isn't that exciting when our mob can get opportunities overseas? He's very active in raising awareness of the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal professionals play in the practice of law, and particularly in those areas that impact on our mob. So please, without any further ado, our last keynote for the day, Ivan Ingram.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a bit daunting being the last person to speak because I realise I'm between, my time is between us and drinks. So I'd like to begin with acknowledging the Ngunnawal people for welcoming us onto their land, and Aunt Glenda, yes, I will claim you now, said that we're related over lunch, so there we go. I'd like to acknowledge that we're visitors here conducting business, and thank you for welcoming us to be able to have this dialogue today. So I guess a bit of background of myself, as thanks Robin for identifying that I'm both a Wiradjuri man and a Filipino. I like to term that as a Philo-original. I'd also like to say thank you to both Robin and Michelle for the invitation to speak here today. It's quite daunting speaking amongst such a high calibre of keynote speakers and our panellists today. I'd like to think that, I'm still a young person that can be told to sit back down and not yet necessarily leading the way, but the topic that I've been asked to talk about is young people leading the way. leading, I guess, is a bit of a misnomer in this sort of talk, in the sense that the path that I'm on has already been cleared by and large by the people who you heard today. So the journey that I'm on has already been set, and it'll come to a point, hopefully down the track in a few decades, where the path will be unclear and that my generation can then step up and create a new path of people who will come behind us. So my background is in native title law. I've been practicing since 2016 in Brisbane. I had to get away from New South Wales because it turns out I'm related to half the state and makes it quite difficult to practice native title when everyone's your aunt and uncle. So practicing in Queensland in the Torres Strait for the last couple of years, but I've also spent some time at the University of Arizona in Tucson in the United States. That's where I first met Michelle. When she was over there working on her Fulbright. So my area of scholarly research is in international human rights, looking at the native title system through the lens of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and particularly how we are enabling or not enabling the recognition of land rights and land justice for our people. So that thesis is being written up as I spend most of my nights over a glass of wine and thinking of some ideas and topics that I could deviate away from in terms of my thesis, because I think most PhD students find themselves procrastinating by finding other interesting topics to write about. So I initially had a very academic piece to present to you today, but Michelle reminded me that it doesn't need to be an academic dissertation of 9,000 words with a lot of citations. So I'm going to go rather off the cuff and abandon that talk that I was going to talk to you about. But I wanted to share three things that I've been involved in. So the first is my work with the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus at the international level at the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, as well as with the Food and Agriculture Organisation, with the Rome-based food agencies. The second part is talking a bit about native title and the role of young people in the post-determination space. And then thirdly, looking at sort of my journey of where I've come to where I am now and the kinds of work that I've been doing with community organisations such as Digi Youth Arts, which is a youth art company. So I guess just reflecting on the various different speakers that we've had today, we've spoken a lot about different principles of governance and leadership in various different spaces, whether it be in the corporate space, the community development space, specific for women, or whatever the case may be. As Michelle started off today with, leadership and governance is at the heart of what we do. It's not something that's learned, it's a process. It's not sort of a popularity contest. Often the case, people fall into positions of leadership for the qualities that they have and for the initiative that they take. Reflecting on what Lydia said, the importance of having differences in our discourse and the difference of positions, because we aren't one homogenous brain to think alike. There is a lot of difference amongst us, a difference of experiences, a difference of culture, and our journeys are all quite different across the entire country. Thinking about what Andrea had just touched on prior to me speaking about the various different learnings and insights that she wishes to impart upon the next generation, thank you for those. I find that quite insightful. Particularly what I've always thought of, that last point that you raised, learn, study and grow your mind. That's one thing that our generation definitely has to do. An opportunity that was not necessarily provided for the generations before us, 1 or 2 generations ago. We were not counted as citizens of this country. That's a little over 50 years ago. Then a little 27 years ago, we didn't have the native title regime, and that's come in, and we've had a generation of that now. And we're now in a space where we are able to reorganise, I guess, in the native title post-determination space around nation building and governance structures. And so my generation will be inheriting that system that's been created for us, and that's been set up by the people here in this room and our elders before us then. So the role, I guess, of young people in leadership and governance, I like to still think that I'm learning a lot and I still have a lot more to learn. Being 28 years old, I still am daunted by the idea of stepping up and getting involved and being a leader in my own respects. So I'm still on a learning journey, like most people my age and younger, and a little bit older. But we really have to be there to listen from our elders, seek guidance from them, and take direction and lead from them. So at the very core of what we do, it is culture. Michelle touched on that in her opening remarks. We don't do what we do because just for the fun of it. It's who we are, it's the culture that we're born into, and it's the system that we've inherited. The challenges as a young person I've found is not all of us are able to live on country or work on country and have opportunities on country. Most of us have to relocate to urban centres. I moved from Parkes to Brisbane for university opportunities and work opportunities because it just wasn't available in my town. What most people end up doing, they either work for council or for the mine. It's quite challenging if you want to pursue tertiary education. Everyone does have to relocate, and it's not often the case that you have the opportunity to go back, not after many years when those opportunities really arise. There's also a disconnect between the generations. From my work in native title, I've really seen what intergenerational trauma and the history that we've inherited does to community. Speaking to elders who lived under, at least in the Queensland regime, the Protection Act, or the 1897 Sale of Opium and Control of Aborigines Act, where people were denied the opportunity to share their culture, to speak their language, and to live on country. People were taken off country and moved onto reservations and missions. Those scars are still very real today. If I'm speaking to an elder who's over the age of 50, you can really see that they still live under that regime. The mindset is there, and it does get passed down from generation to generation. So that disconnect from culture is a real issue and challenge that we have to deal with as young people and for the generations moving forward. Native title, for what it's worth, does provide some opportunities for the revitalisation of culture and custom, but that system in itself is quite flawed because it was written by a non-Indigenous government in response to an Indigenous land rights activist movement. And the creation of the Native Title Act in 1993 was a legislative response for government to learn how to re-deal and renegotiate their relationship with blackfellas. So the system that we're working with is one that's been imposed, and we just have to, I guess, work with it or go around it. So today a number of people have touched about that there are often doors that we can walk through. Native title is one of those, but it's not the only way through. You have to go around, knock down the door, go through the side window around the back. So and a real big gripe of mine at the international level is we often talk in a deficit discourse. Everyone is a statistical anomaly or a statistical issue we have to deal with. Young people are recognised, high rates of incarceration, youth suicide. If we start changing the discourse, then we can start empowering our young people, because if it's inherently negative at the start, that's the mindset you'll have taking it into the future and how you address those issues. So it's got to be from a different point of positionality. So there's some of those issues that I wanted to talk on, but in terms of some of the good approaches or attempts at good approaches of what young people are doing, I'm involved in what's called the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Back in 2016, I was fortunate, while I was studying at the University of Arizona, fortunate enough to be sent to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in New York, the annual meeting that happens around late April, early May. The former Special Rapporteur for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Jim Anaya, was one of my supervising professors and said, go along, see what it's about. I met up with a number of Indigenous young leaders from around the world. Australia and New Zealand were represented, but we had people from all over. The regions that the GIYC represent, so at the international level, the collection of Indigenous peoples are sorted into sort of 7 socio-cultural regions. They're the Arctic region, Asia, Africa, North America, the Pacific, Central and Southern America and the Caribbean, and the 7th being Eastern Europe, Russian Federation, Central Asia and Transcaucasia. That's a bit of a mouthful. But the 7 regions are represented by our caucus, and it's quite amazing the work that some of these people are doing. I like to think that Latin America are one of the best in the world in terms of being organised at the international level. Because one of the, when I was speaking in Tucson recently, lecturing on native title rights here in Australia, one of the questions that was posed to me from from a student in the classroom, which took me a little bit by surprise. They asked if the work that I do is safe in Australia, whether if I'm actually worried about my personal safety. It took me by surprise because it's something that I've taken for granted. We can speak as loudly as we want. We can be that angry person in the room. But in the end, we can go home not worrying about our safety of our person. Some of our brothers and sisters around the world don't have that luxury. And so the collective organisation of those young people is almost really next level, because they do, in some respects, particularly our brothers and sisters who live in the Amazon region or in South America, have that fear for their life and their safety. So what you can see there on screen, this was earlier this year in April when I attended again this at the Permanent Forum. That's the GIYC collective, so there's representation from each of the regions. We're sort of like a self-governed body. We elect 3 co-chairs each year, one from a different region, aiming for gender balance. And then underneath that, for each of the 7 sociocultural regions, there are between 3 and 4 focal points represented. Similarly again, gender balance and distribution across the various different countries that fall within those different regions. The presence of the GIYC at the Permanent Forum has been a thing since about 2006. So we're going into our 13th year of operation. In 2008, that was when we were officially recognised as an active UN working group. And recently we've started expanding our operations outside of the Permanent Forum to engage in other international forums such as the Expert Mechanism of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Geneva, and more recently with the Food and Agriculture Organisation in Rome. FAO in Rome actually have received a particular mandate to engage with young people in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. So a small collective of us, as you can see on screen, we've been engaged in negotiations with the agency in the development of a global youth forum that's in line with Sustainable Development Goal number 2, the ending of world hunger. That forum is intended to be a space where young people can bring their issues in their countries in relation to human rights issues, of course, and have a dialogue with nation states. So at this stage, we've been negotiating slowly. If you think the machinations of local government and state government and Commonwealth government are really slow, at the UN level, we've been talking about the same document for the last 2 years, but hopefully we'll be wrapping that up next month with our final concluding negotiations. So that forum is intended to be a space for young people at the international level. So it's a proper UN forum that's being negotiated, and that's where hopefully nation states will come and support and also engage in dialogue with us. From my experience, I've noticed that at the international level, there's a lot more collegiality amongst the states, at least in the public face, and we do get some good dialogue with the regions, with the countries that are here in the Pacific, Australia and New Zealand, for example. So the GIYC, I feel like I've aged myself out of the group now that I'm 28. I've stood down formally as one of the focal points and allowing another younger, more active Noongar man named Jack Hollard take over from my representation. But I've sort of retired to where all the retired focal points and co-chairs go, where it's sort of the backroom secretariat where we get made to do all the drafting and work for the young ones who are out there, the young ones out there who are actually doing the leadership side of things. So I'm still able to support the GIYC. One of the things I did want to share with you in terms of great work that young people are doing, this year we launched our first publication. It's called Global Indigenous Youth Through Their Eyes. We partnered with the Institute for Study of Human Rights at Columbia University in New York State to create a really unique collection. We haven't found anything like this in the world in terms of this publication collects stories from each of the 7 sociocultural regions, so there's 17 chapters in this book, of perspectives of young people and what they're doing in their communities. So we've got a collection. Some people have put poetry, some people have used cultural mapping, some people are talking about their individual personal stories. One of our authors from the Russian Federation surveyed nearly 200 Indigenous youth across the entire Russian region because she didn't feel that it was appropriate for her to speak just as one person, so she represented her entire country, which is quite phenomenal. So it's a really great collection. With Michelle's permission, I'll circulate some information about that if you're interested in hearing what young people are doing around the world. So that's a little bit about the GIYC. The other aspect I wanted to touch on, and that photo there, I'm also a part-time photographer. So this is the Butchulla People's Native Title Determination back in 2014 of Fraser Island, and this was the celebration of when the native title was handed down, or the judgment in relation to native title was handed down. The space of native title is quite interesting. It's both positive and negative. If any of you have worked in the native title space, whether as a lawyer on one side, a negotiator, or in the system as a traditional owner, you know that it comes with a lot of baggage and a lot of issues, and this is the space where it can make or break a community. And the journey of native title, while it did precede the Native Title Act and the initial Mabo litigation, native title claims can last anywhere from, now that we're looking, about 24 years to as short as 5 or 6 years. And so I was hoping to get one over the line within 4 years, but it's still taking a lot longer and it's still on foot. So 7 years is the shortest that we can get it to at this stage. But yeah, so native title in itself is quite an interesting piece, because the journey in native title, you have to prove who you are, where your country is, who you belong to, and who your ancestors are. That's, you know, establishing connection, where you're connected to and where your lands are. That evidentiary burden and legal burden to prove is quite phenomenal. It's very intrusive, it's really clinical, and then ultimately it's assessed by non-Indigenous actors. So you, in the process of making a native title determination application or making a claim, you have to prove who you are. So we go out into community and we interview everyone, and they spill their entire history, put it down to paper, and then hand it over to, and in native title litigation, to the state or territory that you're in. And so the state of Queensland or the state of New South Wales will assess whether you're black enough under white law. So that in itself is quite terrible, but if you can come out the other end as a community, you're then expected to operate in the post-determination space. The entity that you're working under is what we call the Registered Native Title Body Corporate, or PBCs for short, as people know it as. And that corporate entity is the governing body for your mob. There's a lot of positives that can bring, because that you now have a legal entity to interface with the different spheres of government. But the negatives with the PBC space is that it's corporations law. It's not traditional law, it's not your traditional customs, and it's not your traditional decision-making processes. You can have that reflected, but they're inherently adapted to corporate processes, which makes it quite challenging. So I see one of the great opportunities for the next generation coming through, because the generation that's been has really led the way of getting this initial recognition of native title and getting us to this stage. The next generation will have to grapple with, how do we maintain culture and custom while operating in a space that isn't really our own? It's for the convenience of non-Indigenous proponents and actors to be able to engage with us at their level. So what the challenge will be for my generation and the generation after me is navigating that interface. We have to be skilled in both sets of law, our own law and custom, as well as the Western legal constructs. And it's not just the body of the Native Title Act, it's every piece of legislation, regulation and policy that relates to land. And that's a phenomenal challenge, even for lawyers. We specialise in a specific area and we're never across the entire body of what touches and deals with native title. So that in itself is going to be a massive challenge for the future, one that I'm sure most of us are happy to take on, but there may be other avenues moving forward. So for what it's worth, native title is a great conduit between the Western legal system and the non-Indigenous world and the Indigenous legal systems. There's a lot of successes that can come out of this. I've been working with a number of groups who are looking at succession planning. We've noted that some PBC directors are quite aged and the entire board is lacking of people under the age of 60. And so they're now taking steps to intentionally invite young people, and not young people as young as me, people like between their 30s and 50s, to start coming in and getting upskilled so that to come in and really get involved in the governance of their community. So I guess, so where to from here? There is a great mantle that we have to inherit and that we have to take on, and the challenges are numerous and constantly proliferating. But this year's theme for NAIDOC, Voice, Treaty and Truth, I think it really reigns true of where we sort of stand now. The journey that's sort of been led up until this point, over the last 5 years, I've noticed a real discourse around reflection of how did we get here and how can we move forward. For me, I see those three words as equal. You don't get a voice without, if treaty is a vessel, whatever the case may be, you don't have a voice without treaty speaking the truth. You don't get to the truth if your voice isn't heard and you don't have a treaty. And similarly, the treaty doesn't exist if you don't have a voice that speaks the truth. So it's more sort of like a triangle, I guess. But what treaty might mean? What does sort of treaty entail? We heard the Social Justice Commissioner a couple of years ago say that there are hundreds of treaties already on the Register of Indigenous Land Use Agreements. Those agreements are a form of treaty. It's a negotiation between the traditional owners and a particular proponent, whether if it be the state or mining companies. But if you want to look at it as a treaty, it outlines a number of obligations for both sides. It might be an unequal treaty in terms of where the power is held, but that's one model. Queensland has recently announced a path to treaty, so the government will start looking at what that entails and how to roll that out over the next 18 months. I don't think anything official has been officially released for that, but the current government is looking at a process similar to, but a little bit distinct from Victoria in terms of the legislated treaty process. So what that entails is a challenge for us to grapple with and deal with. But yeah, moving forward, there are a lot of avenues and opportunities for mob to get out and really occupy spaces that aren't traditionally the spaces for Indigenous peoples. So moving away from sort of social services and the traditional sense of where people go for work and going into the other skilled areas of law, business, finance, and whatever the case may be. I wanted to sort of leave on a couple of reflections, finish up with a couple of reflections on sort of my journey of where I got to now. I recall back in high school when our then principal, Brother John Hylitz, said to our graduating year that if you have the potential to do more and be more, then why not? And so I've always held that mantra sort of close to heart. I haven't really shared that with anyone. It feels a bit cheesy, so bear with me as I go with that. And I've always, I know that I have a particular skill set that's useful. Like, my understanding of the law and the technical aspects of it, I really want to use that for the betterment of our mob. So in terms of law reform and policy development, that's the space where I'd really like to be and be engaged in. I see that being at the coalface of native title, it's kind of on the ground and in the face of government. It has a lot of challenges and barriers in itself, and so the strategy should never be just that one path that you take. Internationally, that international advocacy is one thing that I like to approach at. I know that the UN system, for what it's worth, a lot of people find that it's quite futile or there's not much reaction from it. But at that international space, that's where you can get engaged with and have dialogue with people of similar mindset, similar experiences, and you can get access to government at its highest level when you're speaking over there. I've been told it's called the boomerang effect. You go overseas to the UN, you have a conversation with people at the higher levels, and when you come back, that's where you can implement things. Not the UN systems themselves, but the actors who are over there from your home country where you can actually have that engagement. So that's another strategy that you can employ. And then also the little things that you can do for your community. I'm involved with a youth art company called Digi Youth Arts. It's run entirely by an Indigenous board, and it supports young people in all forms of expression of their art. Our culture is inherently embedded in song, dance, and all forms of expression. So that's the one thing that we want to preserve, and particularly for our young people, providing that space and opportunity to be supported in a professional art space. So the three tiers I'm sort of getting at is that community, at the regional and national level, and where possible, internationally. They're the kinds of strategies that need to be in place to better sort of the position of Indigenous peoples moving forward. This quote here is from this book. It's from a quite inspiring man, Jesse Martin from Cairns. His background has been primarily in boxing, and he started the streets movement up north to provide an avenue and opportunity for young people to express themselves and be supported in and around school and in their community. His quote from his chapter is quite great. "In our lives as young Indigenous men and women, hard times will come. However, what is in your control is how to respond to these events. If you embrace these challenges and use them as motivation to better yourself, rather than caving and crumbling to the challenge, you can and will exceed and thrive in this world." Thank you.